Today I'm wind testing popular backpacking tents at 50 miles an hour.
Pushing all these tents to their limits, and some of them really surprised me. So let's check it out. I spend a lot of time testing and reviewing gear in real world conditions. There's only one problem with this. I can't control the real world. Sometimes it's windy and sometimes it's not. So I went looking for a way to test several tents where I control the variables. And this is what I came up with, strapping the most popular backpacking tents to the top of my car and driving fast down a private runway. Okay, we are here and we have rented an airport just so that we can do this test. And of course, the day that we have the airport reserved, it is going to rain pretty much all day long. And so that's gonna make testing a little bit more difficult, but we're just gonna go with it because, I mean, this isn't a real world test, but I guess it is a little bit now, so here we go. To give a good representation of the most popular backpacking tents, I decided to test 3 trekking pole and 3 freestanding tents, including the MSR Hubba Hubba, the Big Agnes Copper Spur, the ZPEX Duplex Zip, and of course the X-Mid 2 Pro. And because all those tents are fairly expensive,
that's a $600 tent.
I decided to test 2 affordable options, including the Nature Hike Cloud Up 2 and the Featherstone Backbone 2. Now my hunch is that the trekking pole tents are going to outperform the freestanding tents for 2 reasons. Trekking poles are stronger than most tent poles, and the way that most trekking pole tents are designed, the forces are applied in a downward direction where freestanding tents get more lateral forces. But there is one big benefit that freestanding tents have over trekking pole tents, and that is the stakes. Trekking pole tents need multiple stakes to be able to stand when there's no wind. Remove even one stake and the stability is severely compromised. So even if the poles are stronger, the big question is, how much wind does it take to pull out the stakes? Since I'm strapping these tents to a wooden platform, I had to get creative. So I purchased several of these digital force meters that I'm attaching where stakes usually go. Then I used the same force meters to measure just how much force it takes to pull a stake out of the ground. This way I'll be able to drive the tents down the runway and see exactly how much force the wind is pulling on each stake. And 25. And this provided an interesting side study. I ended up testing several different stakes, including the MSR groundhogs. I did multiple pulls and found that the groundhog stakes only performed second best, requiring an average of 45.3 pounds of force to come out of the ground. The best performing stakes were these 8-inch aluminum nails by Easton that needed 55.8 pounds of force to be pulled out of the ground. And the worst performing stakes were these V-shaped stakes that came out of the ground at just 23.14 pounds of force. That's interesting by itself, but what we really want to know is how much wind does it take to pull a stake out of the ground. My plan is to run each tent down the runway at gradually increasing speed until I get to 50 miles per hour. This way we'll get to see how each tent performs at multiple different wind speeds, and if any tent makes it past 50 miles per hour, we'll keep pushing till we find the tent's failure point. Should we do 70? All right. Let's do 70. So, starting with the worst performing tent, the ZPEX Duplex Zip, which failed on our first run at just 30 miles per hour. All right, well, the Duplex is done at 30 miles an hour. That's kind of disappointing. That's a $600 tent. Actually, I think that's a $700 tent. $700, 30 miles an hour. This tent is not going to be usable again. This little strap that connects the back corner to the guy line completely snapped. And I did contact ZPEX about this, and they said that in 6 years and thousands of tents, they've only seen this happen 3 times, so you will have to judge whether or not this is something to be concerned about. Next was the Big Agnes Copper Spur. That made it past 30 miles per hour with no problems, but at 40 miles per hour, managed to snap a pole. So I'm a little surprised that it has collapsed at 40 miles an hour, especially with those 2 extra guide lines that we rigged on the front of it. And now is probably a good time to mention that I only employed extra guide lines when they were supplied from the manufacturer. Except on the Featherstone Backbone, which was one of our budget tents, the Backbone did supply peak guide lines that I accidentally overlooked when testing, and I wish I had the opportunity to test it again because it failed where the vestibule clips to the guy line. Had I deployed the peak guy lines, that might have relieved some of the stress on this plastic clip, preventing this failure. I had high hopes for that tent too. You always want the cheap tents to perform well. That said, even without the peak guidelines, the Backbone managed to make it to 40 miles per hour. Now, I really thought the Durson X-Med Pro was really going to perform the best, but I also thought that the Duplex was going to perform better than it did, so. With the narrow end facing the wind, the geometric shape leaves no broad facing sides, and it seemed to shed wind easily, blowing past 30 miles per hour with hardly a ripple. But at 40 miles per hour, one of the back corners ripped through its stitching.
The fact that you're still filming tells me something happened.
If I'm being honest, that's a little disappointing. Both of the trekking pole tents have failed, both at the rear corner. And so wind coming around the tent is just too much. I contacted Dan Durson about this, and he says this is a known issue. Early X-Med Pros only received one set of stitches on 2 of its corners, where they should have received 3 sets of stitching. Basically, this loop of webbing stops somewhere just after the first bar tack, where it should go all the way up through these other 2. This has since been improved so that all 3 bar tacks are holding these corners, but only on tents that were purchased after June 2023. That being said, 40 mile per hour sustained winds is nothing to be ashamed of. But the first tent to blow past 30 miles per hour, blow past 40 miles per hour, and make it all the way to 50 miles per hour wasn't a trekking pole tent like I thought. It was the MSR Hubba Hubba. And the thing that I thought was going to be this tent's weakness was actually its strength.
It's about this tent that makes me wonder how it's going to perform in the wind. This is the only tent that has this. It's not really carbon fiber, but they're not aluminum like most freestanding tents. It's like it's something very similar to carbon fiber. And so these poles, they're very nice and lightweight, but I don't know how strong they are, so we're going to find out.
But these composite poles, even though they collapsed at 50 miles per hour, they didn't snap like the aluminum poles of the copper spur.
Poles don't seem to have snapped, they just collapsed. They seem to be popping back up. Okay, so the really good news is the tent seems to be okay. Like, nothing has ripped. You could use this tent again. So even though it would have been really scary and not very much fun if you were in this tent at night when it was raining and storming like that, you're not in like a bad situation unless because of a collapse you got a bunch of water all over your sleeping bag or something like that. Like, as long as everything was still dry and you're not facing freezing temperatures, you could continue to hike the next day and this tent would be fine. So that's some good news.
But the tent that surprised me the most was the Nature Hike Cloud Up 2. At the time of recording, this tent is only $135 on Amazon, and it too blew past 30 miles per hour, 40 miles per hour, and collapsed once again at 50 miles per hour. But what surprised me was that it didn't break.
So this pole is bent, but it's not broken.
Partly because it's still functional and partly because it's so cheap, this was the first tent we decided to push to 60 miles per hour.
Can we put it back together and go 60?
And as expected, it did collapse, but it didn't break.
It's good as new.
So we decided to see if it could handle 70 miles per hour, and again, it didn't break, which means we could have kept going, but I think you get the point. So that's 6 tents with varying levels of performance, but what are all the takeaways from this? As I mentioned, freestanding tents seem to do better than trekking pole tents, and I think for the opposite reason than what I originally thought. The rigidity of the trekking poles meant that there was absolutely no give, which made the stitching, the webbing, and the plastic the weak spots on these tents, whereas the freestanding poles were able to flex with the wind, putting less stress on the stitching and the material. Ultimately, stakes were not a problem so long as you're using groundhogs or Easton stakes or the equivalent. Through all my testing, none of the force meters ever saw a force above 30 pounds, which means that these stakes would have been fine. Now, why did the cheap Nature Hike tent perform as well as it did? Well, I think it's because this was the only tent with a single front entrance. All the other tents had side vestibules that stuck out quite a bit further than the Nature Hike tent. Even the Durson, which is much more streamlined, still had a broader face against the wind. wind. I think that the skinny, narrow design of the Nature Hike tent combined with slightly stronger aluminum poles helped it perform well against the wind. Now, of course, you are sacrificing convenience, weight, and more to have an affordable tent that does well in the wind, but if you're willing to make those trades to save some cash, this is a pretty decent tent. And last, this test only focused on wind performance. There are plenty of other factors that make a tent a good tent, and I have more in-depth videos for just about all these tents that I will link in the description below. And if you really like this style of video that takes a more scientific approach to gear, you should really check out this playlist right here. Please like, subscribe, and do all those other things, and as always, thanks for watching.
Still perform better than the Z-Packs.